By the time the first light spilled over Kruger's horizon, the sky was already bruised with the memory of the storm that had passed in the night. Dark clouds still clung to the far-off hills, but the worst had moved on, leaving behind a world washed clean. The acacia trees glittered with raindrops, and the long grass, heavy with water, bowed under the weight of dawn. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the smell of wet earth and crushed wild sage. On the porch of a small, weather-worn ranger station, Daniel Moyo wrapped his hands around a chipped enamel mug of coffee and watched the savannah slowly wake. At 61, Daniel moved with the deliberate care of a man who had lived several lives in one body. Deep lines framed his eyes, lines cut by sun and worry and laughter he didn't often share. His hair had turned the gray of dry elephant bones, his back stiffened in the early mornings, but there was an unwavering alertness in him, a quiet intensity. He had spent more than 3 decades walking these lands, watching lions and leopards and elephants live out their stories under a sun that never tired. This place had claimed him. It had taken his fear of being alone and replaced it with a different kind of companionship, the silent, powerful presence of wild animals who made no promises and told no lies. Lions, especially, had become like family to him. He knew their prides, their bloodlines, their quirks. He knew which lioness favored ambush hunts in the riverbed, which old male preferred to sleep on the same termite mound every winter. He knew the sound of their roars the way some men knew the voices of their neighbors. He took a slow sip of coffee and closed his eyes for a moment, listening. Far away, beyond the mopane trees, hyenas whooped, a chaotic chorus fading as they slunk back to their dens after a night of scavenging. A francolin called sharply from the bush. Somewhere closer, a zebra snorted, followed by the soft thudding of hooves. Then, faint, almost lost under the sighing grass, came another sound. A low, throbbing rumble, a lion's roar, but not the full chest-tearing proclamation that rolls across the plains at night. This one was shorter, strained, broken at the edges. A lioness. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He turned his head, listening. There it was again, fainter but unmistakable. A lioness calling from somewhere near the old Marula Ridge to the south. He glanced at the old clock bolted to the station wall. His patrol wasn't due to start for another hour, but his body was already moving before the thought fully formed. He set the mug down, grabbed his binoculars, radio, first aid kit, and the small metal case of veterinary supplies they kept at the ready. He paused only once, his hand resting briefly on the doorframe. Storms like last night's could bring down trees, flood riverbeds, separate young from mothers. They left, everything a little more fragile, a little more on edge. He stepped out into the damp morning and walked to the Land Cruiser, its paint faded by countless seasons. The engine coughed, then settled into a familiar growl. As the vehicle rolled away from the station, he felt that old bittersweet stirring inside his chest, the feeling that something was about to change, and that the land had chosen him to witness it. The roar came again, louder now as he headed south. He knew the lioness who frequented that area. Everyone at the station did. She was from the Ndlovu Pride, a powerful female with a tawny coat a shade paler than most, as if the color had been washed out by the sun. A faint notch in her left ear made her easy to identify. Over the years, Daniel had watched her raise 3 litters, lose cubs to drought and hyenas and a rival male, and still, she endured. He had a name for her, one he kept to himself. Amal, the beautiful one. He crested the rise of the Marula Ridge as the sun broke fully over the horizon, spilling gold across the world. He stopped the vehicle, turned off the engine, and let the silence settle. The land stretched out in front of him, rolling green in patches where water lingered, scrubby and brown elsewhere. In the distance, a line of elephants moved slowly, like gray stones drifting across a sea of grass. Closer, a small herd of impala grazed nervously, ears flicking. Then he saw her. Amali lay in a shallow depression near a cluster of rocks, half hidden by grass, her flanks heaving. Even from this distance he could see the tension in her body, the tightness around her mouth. She shifted, winced, shifted again. He lifted the binoculars. Her sides rippled with contractions. She was in labor. A pang of awe and worry shot through him. He had seen lions give birth before, but always from afar. A distant glimpse of a lioness slipping away to a secret den, a fuzzy cub appearing weeks later at her heels. Birth was their most guarded moment, vulnerable, instinctive, fiercely private. The fact that she was out here, in the open, struggling, it wasn't right. "Come on, girl," he murmured under his breath. "You should be hidden in a thicket, not lying where vultures can see you." Her roar split the morning air, raw and pained. He saw her push, body tensing, claws digging into the soil. Nothing. A cold, precise awareness settled over him. A lifetime of experience sifted through the scene in front of him and collected into one clear conclusion. Something was wrong. A malpositioned cub. Exhaustion. A complication he couldn't name but could feel in his bones. For a moment, an old fear brushed against his heart. Years ago, he had watched a different lioness, young, inexperienced, struggle through a difficult labor. He had been too far, too late. By the time he and the vet arrived, the lioness had died, her cub stillborn beside her. He had stood there in the dusty light of late afternoon, helpless anger, roaring inside him, feeling as if he had failed something larger than himself. Not again, he thought now. Not this one. Not Amali. He keyed his radio. "Base, this is Daniel," he said. "I have a lioness in distress near the Marula Ridge. I think she's in labor and something isn't right. I need the vet team out here as soon as possible." The reply crackled back. "Copy, Daniel. We're on our way. 30 minutes, maybe 40. He did the calculation in his head. 30 minutes could be a lifetime. He turned the key again and slowly rolled the vehicle closer, careful to keep a respectful distance. He didn't want to spook her, didn't want to add stress. He stopped when he was about 40 meters away and cut the engine. Amali lifted her head, eyes burning into the vehicle. Her lips curled slightly, baring teeth in a soft, warning growl. Her body tensed, then a wave of pain hit her and she dropped her head back to the ground, panting heavily. The turf around her was matted with flattened grass and dark stains where her waters had broken. He could see a small protrusion beneath her tail, something pale, glistening. A cub caught in the birth canal. He felt his throat close. He sat there for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles ache. Every training manual, every protocol screamed at him to stay in the vehicle, to wait for the vet, to let nature take its course when they couldn't keep up with it. But another voice rose in him, one that did not belong to manuals. It sounded like his mother, long gone, telling him as a boy that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was doing what needed to be done in spite of it. His eyes went back to Amahale. She tried to push again, muscles rippling, a low moan of effort tearing from her throat. Her body shook. Nothing. He made his decision. He took a deep breath, got out of the Land Cruiser, and walked around to the back to retrieve the silver vet case. His hands moved quickly, almost by muscle memory. Gloves, lubricant, a small dose of sedative they sometimes used in emergency field births, sterile cloths. He knew this was madness. He also knew he couldn't sit and watch her suffer, knowing he might have made a difference. He started walking toward her. Every step felt like 3. The world narrowed to the sound of his boots in the wet earth and the harsh, stabbing rhythm of his heartbeat. The air smelled of rain and lion and iron. Amal's head jerked up as he approached, her ears flattened. A deep growl rumbled from her chest, vibrating the air between them. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "It's me. It's Daniel." It was a foolish thing to say. She did not know his name, but she knew him. Over the years, he had watched her from the vehicle, always respectful, always giving space. He had sat quietly as her cubs played in the road a few meters away. He had turned off his engine and waited patiently as she led her pride past. He had never chased her, never harassed her, never forced her to move. She knew his smell, his silhouette, the sound of his voice carried on the wind. He stopped about 10 meters away and lowered himself slowly to his knees, making himself smaller, less threatening. He kept his eyes on her, but not in a direct, challenging stare. Her growl subsided into a deep, ragged pant. When the next contraction gripped her, her head dropped again, and she focused entirely on the pain, on the impossible task of bringing life through a body that was failing her. He edged closer. 5 meters. 3. He could feel her breath now, warm and sour on his skin when the wind shifted. Her eyes flicked to him once, questioning, clouded with pain. She was too exhausted to rise, too consumed to attack. He reached her flank and stopped. There she was, a fully grown lioness, muscles quivering, claws gouging the ground. The fur along her spine twitched with every wave of agony. Her tail lashed weakly, then stilled. "Easy," he whispered again. "Easy, Amali. Let me help." He moved behind her with infinite care, watching her ears for warning signs. Up close, he could see the cub's hind legs protruding, slick and limp, the small body trapped. Breach. He swallowed hard. He slid on the gloves, coated his hands, and with a breath that felt like a kind of prayer, he placed his fingers gently around the tiny legs. The cub was still alive. He felt it, a weak instinctive kick against his grasp. He worked carefully, avoiding sudden pulls that could damage the mother or the cub. Timing his efforts with her contractions, he added gentle traction, coaxing, easing, pleading silently with muscles and bone and fate. Amali grunted, a sound filled with frustration and fatigue. Her body pressed down. Daniel pulled, slow and steady. The cub shifted. A little more. A little more. "Come on, little one," he murmured, the world around him gone, stripped away to nothing but his hands and this small, slippery body and the lioness whose life hinged on these moments. "You're so close. Don't you dare give up now." The next contraction rippled through Amal like a breaking wave. He pulled. The cub slid free into his hands. For a fraction of a heartbeat, everything stilled. He held the tiny creature, a bundle of wet fur, limp and quiet. Its eyes were sealed shut, its mouth slack. It didn't move. A bolt of panic shot through him. No, no. He wiped its nose and mouth quickly, clearing fluid. Its chest was barely moving, a faint flutter. He did something he'd done before with antelope, with zebra foals, with warthog piglets. He cupped the cub in his hands and gave it a gentle but firm rub along its ribs, stimulating its lungs, urging it to breathe. "Come on," he whispered, his voice shaking now. "Come on, little lion. Breathe." For a terrible, stretching moment, it didn't. Then, all at once, its tiny chest heaved. A thin, rasping squeak burst from its mouth. Daniel felt laughter, and relief and something like tears flood into his throat all at once. He quickly placed the cub by Amale's belly, his hands trembling. She lifted her head with effort, eyes startlingly clear despite the exhaustion. She sniffed the small, wriggling creature, then let out a low, rumbling sound, soft, almost a purr. She drew the cub closer with her paw and began to lick it, rough tongue rasping over its head and back, stimulating it further, claiming it. He sat back on his heels, suddenly aware of his shaking legs, the sweat running down his face despite the cool air. He watched mother and child for several heartbeats, his chest so full it almost hurt. The radio at his belt crackled, making him jump. "Daniel, we're a few minutes out," came the vet's voice. "How's the lioness?" He almost laughed at the absurd simplicity of the question. "She's—" He looked at her again, licking the cub with a fierce, tender focus. "She's a mother," he said softly, "and she's alive. But I still want you here to check her. She's exhausted." He stood carefully, backing away, senses still sharpened, knowing that a lioness with a new cub could turn dangerous in an instant, even one who had just allowed a human to touch her at her most vulnerable. He reached the vehicle just as he heard something that turned his blood to ice. A roar, not a strained, exhausted roar like Amale's, a full, booming, territorial roar, deep and resonant enough to vibrate in his chest. A male. Daniel turned slowly toward the sound. On the far side of the ridge, emerging through the scraggly mopane, walked a lion whose presence seemed to drag the horizon with it. He was massive, shoulders thick, mane dark and heavy, streaked with gold and black. His paws fell with the ponderous certainty of a creature who knew his strength and his claim. His eyes scanned the land, then locked onto the scene in front of him. The land cruiser, the man standing beside it, the lioness on the ground, the newborn cub. His lip curled. The wild turn in the story began there. This was one of the dominant males in the region, a lion known to the rangers as Quito. Years ago, he had fought his way into the pride's territory, driving out older males, and, as lions sometimes do, killing cubs that were not his to bring the lionesses back into estrus. He was both necessary and terrifying, and now he was walking straight toward them. Daniel's mind raced. Male lions often stayed away from birthing dens, but complications changed everything. The scent of blood, the roar of a laboring lioness, the presence of a human. It might all be interpreted as a challenge, a threat, something to be reasserted, controlled. If Keto decided that this cub was weak, flawed, or simply an obstacle, he might kill it. If he decided the strange scene with the human was unacceptable, he might attack Daniel too. The rational part of Daniel's brain screamed at him to retreat into the vehicle, to close the door, to wait it out. But another part, a deeper, quieter part, kept his feet planted. He couldn't leave Amali lying there, barely able to stand, with a newborn cub at her belly and an approaching male whose intentions were unknowable. He found himself stepping slightly to the side, positioning his body not between Keto and the cub, that would be futile, but between Keto and the Land Cruiser, where the vet team would soon arrive. As Keto drew closer, a trembling memory rose unbidden in Daniel's mind. A scrawny, mange-ridden young male lion found years ago, wandering alone near the riverbed, abandoned by his mother, too weak to hunt, half blind from infection. The rangers had debated what to do. Nature was harsh. Intervention could upset balance, but the cub's condition was critical. In the end, Daniel had made the call. They had tranquilized the sick youngster, treated his eyes, cleaned his oozing skin, given him fluids and medicine. For weeks, they monitored him from a distance, making sure he ate the food they left at the edge of the bush, careful not to tame him, only to give him a fighting chance. The cub had survived, grown, disappeared into the deeper reaches of the reserve. A year later, Daniel saw him again, stronger, sleeker, eyes clear. A faint patch where the mane would someday grow carried a thin line of scar from a tracking collar that had been removed. The young male had watched him from a rocky outcrop at dusk, then turned away. That young male had grown into Keto. Did he remember? Could he? Daniel didn't know. Now, Keto stopped about 20 meters away, his mane stirring in the breeze like a dark halo. His amber eyes moved from the lioness to the cub to the human. He let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in the ground. Amali stirred, lifting her head, lips peeling back in a warning snarl. She was in no condition to fight, but some primal instinct flared in her anyway. The cub squeaked softly, pressing closer to her belly. The air felt thick, brittle, as if the entire savanna were holding its breath. Keto, Daniel said quietly, surprising himself by using the name aloud. His voice was steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Easy, boy. The great male lion took a few more steps, closing the distance. He was enormous up close, muscle and power and scars that read like a history of battles won. His gaze landed on Daniel, and for a moment the world shrank to the space between man and lion. Something flickered there. Recognition. Curiosity. Keto's head tilted slightly. His ears twitched. He took another step, slow and deliberate, not in a rush to attack, but radiating attention that could snap in any direction. Daniel kept his posture calm, his shoulders relaxed, his hands at his sides. He did not run, did not wave his arms or shout. He knew better than to look like wounded prey or arrogant challenger. Behind Keto, dark shapes hovered at the periphery of vision, hyenas drawn by the scent of blood and the promise of chaos. Their laughter carried faintly on the wind, sharp and ugly. Keto's ears flicked back at the sound. He swung his head toward them, lips peeling back further now, teeth fully exposed in a powerful snarl. The hyenas hesitated. Then something wild happened. Keto moved, not toward the defenseless cub, not toward the exhausted lioness, not toward the vulnerable human standing foolishly close, but toward the hyenas. With a roar that seemed to tear the air apart, he charged. Dust exploded under his paws. His mane streamed behind him. The hyenas scattered, yelping, tripping over each other in their scramble to escape the fury that had turned against them. He chased them far enough to send a clear message, then slowed, turning back, his tail lashing. Daniel stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. Keto walked back toward them. His demeanor changed. He passed within a few meters of Daniel, eyes sliding over him like a wave. There was no panic, no aggression, only a deep, assessing intelligence. For a brief second, as he moved by, his amber gaze met the ranger's fully. In that moment, Daniel's mind filled with a memory of a young lion, half-starved, blinking against the pain in his eyes as human hands touched him gently, easing the sting, bringing water and life back to him. Did Keto see the same? Did some buried echo of that time ripple through his mind? There was no way to know. But the big male didn't charge. He didn't roar at Daniel. He simply turned his massive head toward Amale and the newborn cub. He approached slowly, the tension in his body coiling again, but in a different way now. Curiosity, maybe. Caution. Amal growled warningly, ears flat. She was torn between exhaustion and the instinct to guard the small life at her side. Keto stopped just short of her, his nose working the air. He leaned down, sniffing the cub, inhaling the scent of blood and milk and newness. For a heartbeat, Daniel's stomach clenched, every muscle in him ready to witness a tragedy he could do nothing to stop. Keto lowered his head further. The cub, blind and tiny, squeaked again, a soft, lost sound. Something in the great male's eyes softened. His tongue flicked out once, then again, rasping gently over the cub's back. Amal's growl died in her throat. Daniel exhaled shakily, not realizing he had been holding his breath until that moment. Keto gave one more soft lick, then settled down beside them, not on top of the cub, not blocking Amali, but close enough that his enormous body partially shielded them from the open land. He lay there like a living wall, mane spreading over his shoulders, eyes half closed but watchful. Guardian, protector, not killer. The wild turn the story had threatened to take twisted again, away from violence, toward something else entirely. The vet truck arrived to find Daniel standing a short distance away, hands still shaking, eyes wet. Amara, the veterinarian, climbed out, took one look at the scene, and froze. The sight was surreal. An exhausted lioness with a newly born cub nestled at her belly. Beside her, a dominant male lion lying calmly, his body angled protectively toward the open savanna, hyenas slinking away at the edges. And a human ranger, standing like a quiet sentinel, close enough to feel their breath when the wind shifted. They dared not approach now. Any attempt to tranquilize either lion could disrupt the delicate balance of the moment and risk the cub. So they watched from afar, binoculars held steady, radios silent. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then mellowed. Amale, under Keto's watchful gaze, regained a little strength. She shifted, guiding the cub to her nipples, allowing it to latch and suckle. The small lion's body quivered with life, its tail flickering occasionally like a tiny golden thread. Keto remained near, rising only to chase off a bold vulture that landed too close, or to face down the circling hyenas until they finally gave up and faded into the bush. He did not challenge the cub. He did not threaten Amale. He stayed like a king guarding his smallest, most fragile treasure. Days later, when Daniel returned to check on them, the three were gone. But tracks told the rest of the story. Large male prints, female prints lighter beside them, small, staggered cub prints weaving between. He followed them at a distance, far enough not to disturb, close enough to reassure himself. He saw them again weeks later at dusk. Amale sitting in the long grass, cub tucked between her forelegs. Keto stood a short distance away, scanning the horizon, his mane glowing copper in the sinking light. At one point, the cub waddled clumsily toward him, batting at his tail. Keto turned, lowered his head, and nudged the small body gently back toward Amale, as if acknowledging both his role and his limits. The years rolled forward. The cub grew. He became a subadult male, mane beginning to sprout, paws too big for his body. He practiced pouncing on shadows, chasing butterflies, stalking his mother's tail. He had a faint pale streak across his back, Daniel's private reminder of where human hands had once smoothed his fur in those first seconds of life. Daniel watched him through storms and droughts, through shifting territories and the slow aging of Keto and Amale. He felt his own body aging too. Climbing into the Land Cruiser hurt his knees more each season. Long walks left him breathing harder, leaning on his rifle not as a weapon, but as a walking stick. The young rangers teased him gently, called him Umhulu, grandfather. He didn't mind. He had lived long enough to see miracles, and that was more than many could say. One evening, well into the dry season, The sky turned the color of embers as the sun sank behind the thorn trees. Dust hung in the air like ghost smoke. Daniel sat on the hood of the parked vehicle, watching the savannah shift from gold to pastel to the blue of approaching night. In the distance, he saw movement. A lion pride padded into view, shapes dark against the fading light. He recognized Amalia immediately, older now, movement slower, but still carrying herself with quiet authority. Beside her walked the young male, now nearly grown, mane thickening around his neck. Quito followed behind, his own steps slower, his eyes still clear. They paused at a shallow rise. For reasons he could not explain, Daniel slid off the hood and stepped a few paces in front of the vehicle, standing alone in the open. The lions noticed. The young male's head lifted. Amali's ears flicked. Quito's tail swayed. None of them moved toward him. Instead, something wordless passed between them, a recognition of a story they had written together without language. A lioness who had allowed a man to touch her as she labored. A cub born into his hands, rubbed into life by his trembling fingers. A male lion who had chosen to protect instead of destroy, to lie down between threats and the fragile new life at his feet. For a brief moment, as the wind carried the scent of grass and dust and lion to him, Daniel felt as if the whole wild world breathed with him. The young male, his mane now beginning to frame his face with the promise of future dominance, lifted his head and let out a roar. It was not as deep as Quito's yet, not as rolling, but it had a clear, strong note that carried across the land. A salute, a statement of existence, of place, of lineage. Daniel felt the sound vibrate through his ribs, through his memories, through the quiet ache in his joints. He smiled, a small, private smile that deepened the creases around his eyes. "Hello, little one," he murmured, though the lion was now anything but little. "You did well." The pride moved on, disappearing into the lengthening shadows, heading toward whatever destiny the ever-turning cycles of life had in store. Years later, when Daniel had finally retired from full-time patrols and spent more mornings on the porch of the ranger station than in the field, he would still sometimes hear a roar on the wind. Sometimes it was distant, a deep thunder from lions he no longer knew by sight. Sometimes, though, it was a voice he recognized unconsciously, the son of Amalie, standing perhaps on the same ridge where he had been born, lifting his head to send his presence across the plains. On those mornings, Daniel would close his eyes and see again the slick, silent cub in his hands, the exhausted lioness, the approaching male, the hyenas slinking at the edges, the way the story could have broken into tragedy. And didn't. He would feel again the awe of realizing that kindness, once offered, sometimes ripples out in ways we could never predict. From a sick, mange-covered cub that once lay half-blind in the dust, to a dominant male lion turning his fury on hyenas instead of a newborn, to a tiny, motionless body learning to breathe under steady human hands, to a young lion's roar years later, echoing gratitude in a language older than words. In the end, the wild turn in the story wasn't just that a man helped a lioness deliver her cub and survived the arrival of the male. It was that, for a brief, fragile moment in the long history of this ancient land, lions and humans stood on the same side, not as masters and subjects, not as enemies and obstacles, but as family, each trying in their own way to protect the same small, precious thing, life itself.